Good morning. We're in Sheffield in the United Kingdom at the University of Sheffield. Sheffield is the 69th best university in the world according to the QS World Ranking. It's among the best 10% university for research in UK, and recently, and we're particularly proud of this, has been voted the best UK university for student experience. So it is a great place where to study, where to do research. So it's not by accident that here in Sheffield, some years ago, was established the Insignio Institute for In Silico Medicine, a joint collaboration between the university and the local Sheffield Teaching Hospital NHS Foundation Trust. Insignio is entirely dedicated to an emerging area called in silico medicine, of which I will tell you more in a minute. But first, let me introduce. My name is Marco Viceconti. I started my career in the late 80s. By background, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I started to work on the research, design, and testing of orthopedic devices. Around the 90s, I progressively moved my research interest toward computational biomechanics and the use of modeling and simulation. And from the early 2000s, almost focused entirely on this new idea of building computer model of individual patient, what we call subject-specific modeling. And from the 2007, everything professional in my life has to do with in silico medicine. This professional journey of mine has been a very, very, very lucky one. It started in Italy at the Rizzoli Institute, but in the last 6 years, he developed this vision here at the University of Sheffield in the Insignio Institute. Before we carry on, allow me to give you some terminology. So first, in silico medicine. In silico medicine indicates the use of subject-specific computer modeling and simulation in healthcare. These are technology that enable a vision for a future healthcare provision that we call predictive medicine, where this model are able to predict things in advance, which are very useful to support the medical decision. There are 3 areas of application of these technologies. The first is called digital patient, and the goal is to develop decision support systems that are used by medical professionals, typically specialists in secondary care setting, in hospital, who will use the prediction of the model to take a decision about an individual patient. The second is called in silico clinical trial. In this case, the model are used in the biomedical industry to develop, design, and test the safety and or the efficacy of new medical products, drugs, medical devices, intervention. There is a third vision that we will not discuss here today, which is called personal health forecasting. The idea is that some of this model one day might actually be so developed to be used by individuals, by patients, for example, to self-manage a chronic condition like diabetes. Another term that will recur during this lecture is virtual physiological human. This is a term that was introduced in 2005, is used primarily in Europe, and it indicates a framework of methods and technologies that enable the investigation of the human body as a single complex system. To some extent, the VPH technology are the enablers of in silico medicine. As I said, in my career, I was very, very lucky. And one of the reasons is that since the very beginning of in silico medicine, I had the chance to have a front seat. In 2007, I was the first author of this roadmap that first described the virtual physiological human. In 2010, together with some friends and colleagues from all over the world, we established the VPH Institute, an international not-for-profit organization that coordinates the research in this field internationally. In 2011, I was the wingman of my dear friend Vanessa Diaz, who led the Discipulus initiative that wrote the first roadmap for the digital patient. And in 2012, Insignio was born here in Sheffield, and I was honored to be the first director of this institute. And in 2013, and this is particularly relevant for today's lecture, the Avicenna roadmap was published. And again, I was the first author of this roadmap, which described this vision of using modeling simulation in the regulatory affairs. I told you about Insignia. When Insignia started, it was a research institute. But a couple of years ago, we kind of changed our mind, and we started also to look a little bit more about teaching, and in particular around graduate studies related to in silico medicine. The reason is very simple. When we started in 2007, in silico medicine was the vision of a few visionary academics around the world. In these 10 years, it has transformed into an industrial reality, which is emerging. It's still a very new idea, but it's emerging. And what we recognize is there is now a need to train the first generation of specialists in this specific area, which are needed by the industry, the hospitals around the world in order to develop. That's why we establish different graduate programs. The latest of is the Master in Computational Medicine that is now open for recruitment for next year, academic years 2018-19. In this graduate programs, I teach regulatory affairs for medical device. But I also have an additional module which look at the regulatory affairs also in relation to in silico medicine. This year we had a very, very small cohort because it was a test run for this new model. And with the students, we decided that it didn't make sense to do frontal lecture. What we did instead, in the last semester, we met every week. We selected some documents, some reports. During the week, we read them, and then we met again and we discussed them. But I wanted to offer this group a goal. So I proposed them that we would prepare a lecture, a magistral lecture of 2 hours that would summarize where we are around the regulatory affair for in silico medicine. They agreed. They're here with me today in the front line. And so we worked to this lecture. And this is what I'm going to deliver to you today. Okay? So let's begin. And it's a good idea to begin from the beginning. And the beginning of the stories is 1964. I was 3. You were not born, by, well, most all of you. It was the year when IBM released a mainframe computer called System 360. And that was the computer, okay? If you would go in any hospital in the world, you would not find any computer at all at that time, except maybe in a few very rich hospitals, maybe in the US, you would find one of these computers, okay? But these computers were designed to automate administrative tasks. So, and that what they were used in the few hospitals who owned them. So in other words, until the mid-70s, no computer was anywhere near any patient anywhere in the world, okay? Things started to change in the 70s when a new generation of computer came out. They were called mini computer, which I found amusing considering they were as big as a wardrobe. But given that the mainframe were as big as a room, it was a significant improvement. I can tell you with personal experience, because the first computer I ever used in my life was a copy of this computer, the digital PDP-11. And that tells you how old I am. Not only this computer was smaller, which means also they were cheaper, relatively speaking. They would typically cost like a house, okay? But they were much cheaper than the mainframe, okay? But the main change was the first time you could program this computer to do anything, not only administrative tasks. And people started to be very creative about the things they could do. And one of the things that came out was that you could control, with this computer, medical equipment. And this brings us to 1982 and the Therac 25. In 1982, a company called AECL produced this system called Therac 25. This was a radiation therapy machine, and it was one of the first medical systems that was controlled by a computer. In fact, that PDP-11 that I just showed you. Between 1985 and 1987, 6 patients were accidentally exposed to massive radiation dose. 3 of them died, and the other 3 remained permanently disabled because of this massive radiation dose. An investigation started, and at the end, it was concluded that the problem was a bug in the software that was controlling the machine. If you're interested in this report from Lewson and Turner, you will find the detail. It's absolutely terrifying. It had to do with the sequence, how fast you would click on the keyboard, the comments. It's ridiculous. But we were at the beginning of computer science. But more important, Therac 25 accident was a wake-up call for the field. We realized that software was dangerous, was potentially dangerous. It was very difficult to produce, actually, we'll see later, impossible, to produce inherently safe software. So there was a problem here. It was not only in the medical field. Other mission-critical areas, for example, air traffic controls, okay, had the same problem. The software was unreliable, and when it went wrong, very bad things would happen, okay? So a new awareness started to emerge. It took some years, but eventually the idea of quality assurance for software artifacts started to appear in the industry. And as it will happen in this lecture, I always mark this event with the publication of the technical standards that somehow capture and formalize this new knowledge. Okay? In this case, 1991, the first ISO standard on software quality is published, ISO ESC 9126. But probably the very big, important turning point happens a few years after, when, as part of the ISO 9000 series, Part 3 is published, which is entirely dedicated to the quality assurance of software products. Until the 80s, quality was a secret owned by Japanese companies. No one in the Western world would know or would think about quality assurance, okay? But as the success of some industrial Japanese company, in particular in the area of automotive, became dramatic, the Western world started to realize that they were missing a trick. There is a funny story around this. In reality, the idea of quality assurance was developed in the 50s in America. Nobody paid attention because it didn't match the Fordian model of American industry. But one of these professors gave a lecture as part of the Marshall Plan to Japanese entrepreneur, and they picked up the idea and they transformed it into a world success. So things comes around and goes around. Anyway, this standard in 97 recognized that quality assurance of software is fundamental. And soon after that, all regulatory agencies in the world start to impose that any medical software had to be produced according to these quality standards. Okay. Software quality assurance is a complex topic. I'm not a specialist, and it's not the main topic today, but there is a general set of principles that today are accepted and somehow represented here. The key point, however, that I want to stress is that if you produce a physical product, a medical device, for example, you have to put a lot of attention in making sure that the design process is done according to the best possible quality standard, and then that your manufacturing, where you make copies of that design, is also tightly controlled to ensure quality. But that's it. Software, instead, it's always a living creature. It constantly changes. There are updates, there are revisions. Operative system, new hardware appears, you have to update the software even if you don't want, because you have to make sure that it continues to run. So software quality is a continuous process. You constantly revise, design, test, analyze, report, go back, revise, and it keeps going forever. Good. But that was it. Until now, medical software, you had just to demonstrate you had a robust quality assurance. That was it. Starting from the 2000, things start to change. First, a new generation of medical devices appear that have software on board. Some of these are high-risk implantable devices like pacemaker or implantable cardiovector defibrillators. This device becomes programmable, which means that the software is part of the medical device. Okay? The second thing is that we see the appearance of a new generation of software solution designed to assist a medical professional in some clinical activity. A classic example are surgical planning software that allow the surgeon to plan in advance in a simulation environment the surgery that he or she is going to perform. Okay? This picture represents the heap of software that my team developed in 2000 exactly, and it was a software for planning total hip replacement, orthopedic surgery. Now, this type of products pose a completely new challenge in terms of regulatory affairs. And the concept of software as a medical device start to appear. This is captured by an amendment that is published by the European Commission in 2007. In the European system, the basis of all the regulatory system is a directive that was published in 1993, is directive number 43, that regulates by law, by European law, in all member states of the European Union, under which condition you are allowed to commercialize a medical device, okay, on which process you have to undergo before you obtain an authorization to commercialize a medical device. Now, in 2007, this law was amended. A number of things were changed, but two are quoted here. The green one showed that among the list of possible things that were considered a medical device, a software was also included. So a software was recognized that it could be a medical device. And when it was that, when the software was directly involved in the diagnostic, prognostic, or treatment, therapeutic process, treatment planning or treatment execution, okay? The second, and this was really bad news for all practitioners, the regulator decided that standalone software as a medical device would be treated like an active medical device. In the original directive, the 93/43, there was a big division between active and non-active medical device. An original active medical device were devices that had a power source. So typically they were attached to the power source, or if they were implantable, they had a battery. Okay. Why? Because there was a recognition that this energy element would add a whole set of risks that would not be present in a non-active medical device. Okay. So in general, the regulatory pathway for active medical devices was more severe, was more restrictive. Okay. So this was very bad news for everyone who was developing medical software, okay, because it meant that the pathway that would appear for software as a medical device would be very severe. It turned out to be not that bad, which you will see in a moment. But still, here there was a recognition from the regulator, or in this case the legislator, that software as a medical device could be risky. So particular care had to be taken. The other thing that was published just a few months before was this standard, the EN 62304. And this is the first standard that describes the quality assurance, or better, how to manage in a safe environment the entire life cycle of software when you're dealing with medical device. So this is the first software as a medical device technical standard, okay? There are two important elements in this standard. The first is that the standard regulates the entire life cycle from the very early software development planning when you set the specification of what the software should do to the very end, the software release, the configuration management, and the post-marketing monitoring when bug reporting comes in and you have to fix and update. The entire life cycle has to be controlled. The second thing is, whereas the ISO 9000-3 was about quality assurance, this new standard framed the problem in a risk management perspective. So you are required as a software developer for software as a medical device to reflect at each step what are the potential risks, what are the hazards, what would be the impact, and strategize according to the class of risk that emerge from this, okay? There are two statements in a couple of annexes that I think are relevant to report. The first is there is no known method to guarantee 100% safety for any kind of software. So there is no inherently safe software. Every piece of software is potentially risky, so you have to have a risk management plan in place. And secondly, testing software is not sufficient to determine that it is safe in operation. That's a very strong statement if you think about it. It means that no matter how thorough you test software, your user will find creative way to break it that you haven't even thought about it, okay? And so that means that once you've tested and released it, you're not done. You have to constantly monitor what's going on, and you go back to this loop I was telling you before, okay? All this described the design and production, and to some extent what we would call the preclinical testing, the bench testing, etc. But nowhere the problem of how to test a software as a medical device clinically was addressed. And that was a very complicated topic, and it took 10 years before this organization produced this document only last year. The IMDRF is essentially a forum where all the regulatory agencies of the world meet periodically in the effort of making their standard processes more harmonized. Why? Because we operate in a global market, so almost every company would like to sell their products in China, in America, in Europe, in Africa, and ideally we should be able to certify once and sell it everywhere. This is not the case. Every country you have to go through a different certification process, but at least in the last few years the regulatory bodies are making an effort to make these processes not too different, okay? So that if you've done in Europe, you have to do again in China, you don't start from scratch. You can reuse 80% of what you've done. That's the general idea of the IMDRF. And they created a work group specifically for the clinical evaluation of software as a medical device, and this document that was published last year is the result of this complex piece of work. It is a very big document. I don't have the time to describe it in detail. About the same time, the European Commission published a guidance document. It was just published a month before, which contains some further clarifications of how you are going to use this instruction, okay? The two key elements that I want to stress here are this. The first, there is a recognition that in software as a medical device there are three moving parts. The inputs, the information that are provided to the software, which might come from data you measure on the patient separately, from sensors that continuously feeds the software for example, in a pacemaker. So inputs are one source of risk that need to be tested clinically. There are outputs, what the software predicts and provides. There are risks there. And then there is the algorithmic part within the software, okay? And how do you build this knowledge? Where are the sources? What is the reliability? So these three elements have to be tested in clinics separately, ideally. The other thing is that they make a sort of a list, and they say, okay, but you know, not all medical software, or even not all software as a medical device, has the same risk level. Okay, there are some software which are relatively low risk, and they require no clinical assessment, or only clinical assessment, limited clinical assessment. Other are much higher risk, and they require a more thorough process. Okay. Now, all this was a big change for the early companies that operated in the medical software. And the reason is this. Before all this new regulatory system around software as a medical device appeared, if you were a software company who wanted to work in the medical area, you had to set up a complete quality assurance system for your software production. Okay? But once you've done that, that software system could be used for multiple products. So if you were a medium or a large software house who had 10 different healthcare products, you had to set up the quality assurance once and use it to monitor all your 10 products. But the system was one, okay? With the new system, you still had to set up a quality assurance framework, but in addition to that, every time a new product was developed, you had to go through the medical device directive regulatory pathway. So, and this had to be done for every new product. Okay? So the burden for the industry was significantly larger. Okay? And especially at the beginning, when nobody really knew what this last passage would look like, everybody was terrified. Okay? But then things turned out not to be so bad. We move one step further. Until now, I talk about software in a very general term. Okay? But what I really care from the in silico medicine's perspective is a subgroup of software that is predicting something. Okay? So let's focus on predictive software. How did we get to predictive software? Well, the journey was the usual one. I mean, at the beginning, the first software as a medical devices codified procedures. So the programs would be a list of procedural action. Typically, they were control software, for example. If the current is higher than due, send a signal of this type. Okay? So they were procedural code. As we went on, you know, some math started to be embedded. You know, for example, the raw signal would be filtered with some Fourier filtering, for example. So some math started to appear within these codes. Okay, and when you have math models, suddenly you're tempted to extrapolate. Okay, so the new generation of intelligent device started to appear, where actually the system would guess that you were going to have a fibrillation before actually you had it, because the extrapolating how certain inputs were growing in time, and the device could intervene and regulate before the bad thing actually happened. And at the beginning, most of this predictive capability were somehow generic in nature. But then people started to say, okay, but if we feed patient-specific information to this model, they would become much more accurate, much more tuned to the individual. And that brought us to what we call digital patient technologies, okay? And so in the following, I will make a distinction between software as a medical device in general and what I call digital patient software as a medical device. And this is a subclass of software as a medical device that has patient-specific predictive capabilities, okay? So is there any software like that? Oh yes, there is. And the good news is that some of this software have already went through the entire regulatory process and are now available as products on the market. So I will tell you about two of these products. Okay. The first is ArtFlow. ArtFlow was probably the first FDA approval software as a medical device that we can consider a digital patient software as a medical device. The procedure that the FDA required for the regulatory approval of this software, in particular the software is called FFRCT, was the 513F2 de novo. And when the FDA tell you this, these are bad news. Why? The entire philosophy of the FDA regulatory system for medical device is revolve around the idea of the predicate. So when you present a new product, the FDA asks, okay, tell me in which family of existing medical devices your product fall, and how similar or different is your product to any one of these products that are already on the market, that FDA are already approved. And this product that you choose to compare with is called the predicate, okay? And all the regulatory process, which is called 510K, is about checking and testing and confirming the safety and the efficacy of all the things that your product has different from the predicate. But they assume that if they were fine in the predicate, if they are identical in your product, they're fine in your product as well. Okay? And that makes the things quite simpler. Okay? But sometime you arrive with a product that has no precedent. It's so new that there is nothing in the database of the FDA. And at that point, FDA say, I'm sorry, de novo. De novo, it's a Latin expression, I mean, from new, okay? From scratch, we would say in English. And that was what is, okay? The good news is that once one company goes through this very complicated process that I will describe you in a minute, a new classification is created. So when ArtFlow finished this pathway, a new classification was created called coronary vascular physiological simulation software, which means that tomorrow any other company who wants to submit to the FDA a product that falls in this category will not have to go through the entire de novo, okay, but only to assess the safety of the things where their product differ from the one that is being approved already, okay? So what is ArtFlow, FFRCT? It's a great idea. You do an imaging, particular coronary CT angiography, to a patient that has what is called a coronary stenosis. Essentially, in the blood vessel that wrap the heart, sometimes a narrowing appears. Okay? And this narrowing prevents the blood to flow and to feed the heart. And if it becomes too severe, you could have a heart attack, you know, a very serious complication. Clinicians use to decide how to treat this patient a single instrumental measurement that is called fractional flow reserve, or FFR for short. The problem is that this measurement is invasive. You have to stick a pressure sensor through the femoral artery up into the heart and measure the drop of pressure before and after the narrowing. Okay? And if the patient has multiple narrowing, in theory, you should do for each of the narrowing. Okay? This exam is expensive, it's complex, involves some risk. Not every cardiology center is able to perform. So even if it is recognized to be the best practice, it's not used so frequently. Okay? The idea of the FFRCT software is that starting from the CT data, you build a patient-specific model that can actually predict non-invasively the same quantity, the FFR. Okay? And so you replace an invasive measurement with a non-invasive, image-based patient-specific model that predicts the same quantity. So what our friends in ArtFlow had to do to get their product FDA approved? all these things. Interestingly, the FDA for all the novel products that are approved make public the detailed documentation, which is shown here. So if you Google, you will find the official with all the detail. I don't have the time to go through all the details, but they are public and they are provided, okay? And you realize how thorough was this examination, okay? And how demanding. So they had to go through all these things, okay? They even had already a clinical trial, but the FDA decided that the trial they had was not enough, and so they had to do a new clinical trial. So they ended up doing 2 clinical trials. Okay. In the end, the product was approved after they demonstrated that for 484 independent vessels on a number of patients, the measured FFR and the predicted FFR were very, very close. Okay. And then the FDA approved it. I found another little piece of public information, which I thought it was very relevant. Our flow capitalization, so how much money they receive from their investor from their birth to today, is a public information, is publicly available, okay? And the number here and the dates are when the new injection of capital entered the company, okay? Next to this, I put the date when the first, the second clinical trial started, when the FDA gave approval, and when the United Kingdom NICE organization emitted their report about the cost effectiveness of the airflow technology, which for UK is an essential requirement for this type of products to be reimbursed. Okay? The reason I'm showing you this is because my point is to do something like this, you need a lot of money. Of course, this is the capitalization. We don't know how much of this cash was burned to do the process, okay? But my suspicion is, considering that they did 2 clinical trials, quite a lot of money. So, especially at the beginning, the investment will be important. Of course, the idea is that the early adopters will have also large rewards. This has to be kept in mind. What about the European system, the CE marking? Recently, a document was published that I already mentioned last year, the MedDev 2.16, which gave us some additional guidance about how to pursue the CE marking of decision support software, which, again, it's restated, is a software as a medical device, but we already knew this. And they gave some example of different type of decision support software and in which risk class they were certified, okay? And that comes out as an interesting thing, because it turns out that even if this software are considered active medical devices, most of them fall under class 2, even some in class 1. So medium or even low risk class. And this makes the regulatory demanding less, the regulatory process less demanding, okay, than the high-risk products that are in class 3. Reading the document and looking at the example, my interpretation is this. In general, decision support systems give one bit of information to a medical professional, a specialist, that use then that bit of information, but also is visit of the patient, other exam, a series of information to take the medical decision, okay? So somehow the risk inherent with the software giving the wrong information is somehow mitigated by the presence between the software prediction and the action on the patient of a third party, of a physical person who is a medical specialist, that, you know, if the software goes completely crazy and gives a completely crazy number that is compatible with everything else the doctors say, the doctor can say, oh, come on, what's wrong here? Okay? This is perceived as a mitigating factor. Okay? And I agree, I think it makes sense. So the presence of a person in the middle in the process reduces the risk. Okay? There are two important exceptions. One is when de facto there is not the person in the middle. For example, fractal dimension analysis for skin cancer was considered a class 3. This is a particular piece of software that, given a picture of the skin lesion, will predict a quantity that is used directly and exclusively to decide what to do with that skin lesion, if it is a cancer or not. So if that software is wrong, you will be misdiagnosed and you will be mistreated. So the risk is very high. The second case is when the decision, even if there is a specialist in the middle, happen in an emergency setting. So for example, the diagnostic image analysis for acute stroke. So a patient comes in the emergency room with the symptoms of a stroke. Okay? They do the imaging, and there is software that can analyze this imaging and provide information to support the decision what to do. But this happened in an emergency setting. And my understanding is that the regulator says, okay, but you know, if you're a doctor and you have to take this decision in 3 minutes and the software gives you a number, you don't have the time to critically revise this recommendation. You take it for good, and if it's wrong, it's going to be trouble. Okay. So the good news is that software as a medical device, and in particular decision support software, in most of the cases will be treated as a class 1 or a class 2 medical device in the CE marking system, with these two notable exceptions that I just mentioned. Okay? And in fact, and this is the second product I want to mention, this software was developed by a colleague and a friend of Insignio, Professor Gasser. It's called VasCop. VasCop actually, again, starting from some medical imaging, helped the doctor to decide if a patient that has an aneurysm in the abdominal aorta, the aorta is the bigger blood vessel we have in our body, and the aneurysm is like a bulging in this blood vessel, okay? And until it's just a bulging, it doesn't have many effects, but the risk is eventually it ruptures, and if it ruptures, you could bleed to death very quickly. So there is a risk that is quite considerable, okay? So deciding what is the risk for that particular aneurysm in that particular patient to rupture or not is a very delicate medical decision. And VasCop is one of the first software that actually helped the doctor to take this decision, okay? I talked personally with the colleagues, and they confirmed that VasCop was certified in class 2B, okay? So we're talking about a very serious condition, but still, because, as I told you, the prediction of VasCop is not used automatically. It's passed to a specialist that, combined with other information, and then decide what to do. The risk class was considered to be medium. Okay, so far we talked about digital patient. What about in silico clinical trials? This new idea that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, that modeling and simulation could actually be used to design and possibly to test new medical products. So here the software is not the product. The software is a tool that we use to develop and test our new products. Okay? Allow me to make a digression here. Now, imagine that you are an engineer who is responsible for the design of one of these huge airplane, passenger airplane, that will carry 600 people. Or you are the engineer in charge of the design of a new nuclear power plant. What would you say if I tell you, well, in order to certify that your product is safe, what you have to do is to produce your new product in a few copies, put them in use, and see how it goes? You would think I'm crazy, no? What happens before any airplane enter in the fabrication cycle in its first copy? Hundreds of computer simulations are run that replicate in the computer all possible things that could go wrong in order to confirm that the airplane will be safe. I don't know if you know, but there is even a standardized computer simulation where you simulate a big bird going through a jet engine, which is one of the things that happens to airplanes where they fly. You know, birds get stuck in the jet engine. So there is a simulation, and there is a standardized size of the in silico bird. And the same for even more, you know, power plants. Years of computer simulation before you start to fabricate even the first part. Okay. So why in heaven medical products safety is tested by give it to a few unlucky guys and see what happens? And where this come from? Who had this idea? Well, that's interesting. That was the guy. He was called Ibn Sina, if there is any Persian in the audience, will help me. I think it means Avus Sina, so his father was Sina, okay? And Avus, in Latin it would be Avus Sina, and it was corrupted in Avicenna, or Avicenna, okay? Ibn Sina was what we would call a natural philosopher, active around 1000. And probably his most important book is the Canon of Medicine, which is considered one of the pillars of medical science ever. Okay? And in this book, for the first time, is described a systematic approach to the evaluation of medical intervention. And if you read it, it looks like a clinical trial. It's not that far different. And in fact, the essence of the clinical trial, in all the sophistication and complication and statistic, etc., but the essence hasn't changed in almost 1,000 years. So the $1 million question that some years ago people around the world started to ask themselves is why we're not allowed to use modeling and simulation. And let's be clear, until 2015, you were not allowed to produce as a primary evidence of safety or efficacy for a medical device or a drug the result of a computer simulation. The philosophy was evidence are only obtained experimentally, either with a bench test or with an animal experiment or with a clinical experiment on humans. Okay? I was among those that started to question the wisdom of this approach, and a number of organizations started to question this and to discuss with the regulator, but more important with legislators, and eventually we convinced them. So between the late July 2015 and early March 2016, both the US Congress and the European Parliament made very similar recommendations to their respective regulator that said, you need to change. You have to create, of course, maintaining the level of safety that citizens expect from your activity. You have to allow industry to use modeling and simulation evidences in the project. I mean, this was a year ago, I mean, a year and something ago. So really we're talking about something that happened very, very recently. And if you saw the progression of dates in my previous slides, normally regulatory affairs happen very slowly, no? Because these are very complicated things, and the regulator and the standardization body require a lot of time for discussion, for thinking, for comments, for reflection, okay. But for once here, we moved very, very, very quickly. And after a little bit more than a year, we already start to have some indication of where we should go. In the meanwhile, in this discussion, another element emerged. So this is the definition of in silico clinical trial that was provided in the Avicenna roadmap that I mentioned you at the beginning. So the use of individualized computer simulation in the development or regulatory evaluation of a medical product, medical device, or medical intervention. Fine. As the debate and the first implementation started to emerge, not an alternative definition, but a different perspective started to emerge. The idea is that modeling technologies, modeling and simulation technologies, could be used to reduce, refine, and to some extent partially replace both animal and human experimentation. Okay? We have problems, we have ethical concern about animal experimentation. We have ethical and operational concern about human experimentation. So if we could reduce this, would be a good thing. Okay? Again, there is a lot of new terminologies in this sentence. So reduce means involving less animal or less patients in the experimentation. Okay? So you still do it, but instead of using 100 mice, you only use 10 mice. Okay? Refine means two different things. For the animals, it means reducing the suffering. Unfortunately, some of the animal experimentation nowadays still involve a certain amount of suffering for the animal involved. So the goal is to refine the procedures so to reduce potentially to zero the suffering of the animal. In human, refined means primarily the level of risk that you expose the patient involved in a clinical trial. Okay? Replace means to entirely replace a piece of the experiment with an alternative method, for example, a model. I say a piece because typically this study have multiple arms. It is unlikely you'll be able to replace, at least for a few years, all of them, but you could start by replacing one of the arms. So you will still do the test on animals in certain condition, but then you would do all the other condition in silico. But there is a fourth element which I think is absolutely important for animal experimentation. I call it improve. This is a term that I use. Is not the first three are now standardized. They're called the 3R. Okay, improve. It's a term that I propose to you. What I mean by improve is that the goal of animal experimentation is to predict in advance what will happen in human. We're not interested to know what is the effect of the drug on the mice. We're using the mice to guess what will happen when we give the drug to the human, okay? So what comes out is that a lot of these animal tests today are not very good in predicting what will happen in the humans. So for me, improve is to make whatever we do preclinically more predictive of what will happen clinically, okay? And that is a fourth dimension to the problem. Okay, let's say that we have this in silico clinical trial technology. What we would do with them? Well, this is largely speculative because we haven't started really yet, or we just started. But this is a potential list. So there are really a lot of things that we could use this technology. As I said, to reduce, refine, and replace animal experimentation, to reduce and improve in vitro testing, to support discovery or design. And then there are a number of things that we could do in the clinical setting. Okay? One I like particular is the so-called in silico augmented clinical trials, where you enroll physical patients, but then you add to the clinical trial also virtual patients. Observation obtained by simulating the treatment on a computer model instead of as a physical patient. And you combine this into information in order to reduce the size of the real patient cohort, or the duration of the clinical trial, or to sample very odd tails in the distribution. For example, you're doing a phase 2 clinical trial of a new drug. Typically, you enroll 100 or 200 patients. What are the chances that among 100 or 200 patients you hit a patient whose body weight is 250 kilograms? Very unlikely. But if you now give the drug to the general population, there will be a small but non-negligible percentage of patients who are large obese. So you could test the drug on your 100 patient and then using the models to extrapolate what would happen, for example, if the patient is a large obese. No? Everything I told you until now, in a way, already happened once. There is one precedent that is already in place. And this is the University of Virginia, University of Padua T1DM simulator. T1DM stands for type 1 diabetes mellitus. The story is interesting. In 2006, a patient organization, the Juvenile Diabetic Research Foundation, which is the American patient organization that represents all the patients and the family that have this disease. I remind you that type 1 diabetes is the one that you have since you're born. So it affects children and adolescents. Well, and then it continues to affect all your life. But it's particularly delicate, the management of these children and adolescents in the first years. Okay? Essentially, this group, this patient organization, they wanted to have what is called the artificial pancreas. So essentially, these children had to self-inject insulin in certain quantity at certain point in time during the day in a very difficult self-management that children and adolescents struggle to have. Why cannot we make a machine that at a given time automatically inject the necessary amount of insulin so to maintain the sugar metabolism under control without the child worrying too much and the family and all the complexity that comes around. Of course, a new regulatory pathway had to be required. And the FDA concluded that before any of this algorithm, and in an artificial pancreas, the really critical thing is the predictive software that analyze the data and decide how much insulin and when. So it's a typical digital software as a medical device system, okay? So the FDA decided that before you could test on human, you had to test these devices on a small number of animals. And they had to be metabolically similar, so large animal like dogs or sheep. This slowed down considerably the development, because every time a small change in the software had to be done, you had to run one of these animal experiments, very expensive, very complicated. Animals were involved, so ethical concern. So they started to say, what can we do? And these two groups, the team of Boris Kovacek at the University of Virginia and the team of Claudio Cobelli at the University of Padua in Italy, have been developing for many, many years the best possible models for simulating sugar metabolism. So with the funding of some sources, they were able to create a simulator that has inside 300 virtual patients, 100 children, 100 adolescents, and 100 adults. Okay? And this simulator could be used as a test bed. Every time a company has a new algorithm, they run it on the simulator. And after a lot of testing and a very thorough process, the FDA concluded in 2008 that they would allow what is called the investigational device exemption, which is essentially the permission to start implant a device on human in clinical trials. Not even without animal experimentation, if you had instead used the simulator to test the safety of your algorithm. Okay? So it was a case where you were allowed to replace the animal experiment with the software. But it was a unique case. And remember where the story starts from. This whole process was initiated by the Patients Association. So it was a case where the regulator felt somehow compelled by the patients themselves. Normally the regulators are there to protect the patients. So when the patients themselves say, come on, help us, we need to speed up, we need to accelerate the rate of innovation, the regulator, thinks, is in a very different position, okay? But that is a very unique story. So where are we today? I mean, if you want to bring to the market an in silico clinical trial technology, what are you going to do? Well, in the last few months, I had a number of conversations with the specialists in this area, both in the Food and Drug Administration and inside the European Medicine Agency. And I have to say, the recommendations I received are surprisingly similar to some extent, with a couple of small differences. So what I got from the FDA is, well, first of all, in every presentation, in every conversation, in every communication, there's always this insistence around model credibility. And you will see in a minute, even the standard that some of these experts are driving goes in this direction, okay? So we'll go back to this point later on. The other three things are very, very similar for both the regulatory agencies. Essentially, they said, this is so new that you don't know and we don't know. So first thing, engage with our specialist. So you're developing a product, talk to us. And the specialist in the FDA is the modeling and simulation work group that was established exactly for this purpose inside the office of the chief scientist. So talk to us, tell us what you're trying to do. We will think about, we will tell you, well, you know, what could be the safety challenge here? How could this be tested? And we have a conversation, which is non-binding, has no legal value. It's, you know, a sort of conversation to start to develop the necessary knowledge. When you feel that you are kind of ready to go through the regulatory process, we recommend that you pursue first what is called a mock submission. So send us your submission, but it's not a formal submission, is a simulation of submission. We will still do a full evaluation, and that's important. This is not something that normally FDA does, but in this very area, they recognize this is necessary. And we will come back with a series of recommendations, which, however, are not legally binding. And that's very important because at the very beginning, you know, your view and the view of the regulator can be very, very different. So you make a submission, produce a series of evidence, and the regulator say, no, 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 this is not what we want to know. We want to know all these other things, you know. And you don't want this to be binding because then the continuation of the process will be very difficult for you as a company. So the idea of having this submission process in a safe box, okay, it's a great asset, and we need to pursue this both in academia and in industry. And then, of course, finally, when you feel that you're okay, then you go through the full submission. But they insist, don't submit the simulation with a product. Separate them. So you do a submission for your simulation environment with the idea that you will use the same model, the same modeling and simulation tool to analyze multiple products. So you certified first the modeling tool as a method, and then every time you use it, you simply have to check a few things that we will tell you, but you don't have to go through the entire process every time. Okay? It's a very clever suggestion, and again, I think we should follow their leads. With different terminology, but the European Medicine Agency gave us very much the same message. So engage with our expert, in this case the EMA Innovation Task Force. Seek for non-binding opinion, which in this case is called EMA Scientific Advice. And then when you're ready, seek qualification. It's not called approved, it's called qualification in EMA jargon, for the modeling tool separately from the products. Okay. So very similar. There is one point that came out recently in a meeting I had with EMA experts, which it never appear as such in the conversation with the FDA. The EMA insists very much on the separation between physiology, disease, and intervention. So the idea is, and this is clear that they're not thinking to the simplest in silico clinical trial model where you use the model to replace a bench test. But they're thinking really to models that are aimed to somehow supplement or replace clinical experimentation, okay? The most challenging one. And they say, remember that if you want to do a virtual patient, you have to have a model for the physiology, another model for how the disease changed this physiology, and then you have a third model that describes how the product that you want to test work in that disease state. Okay? And these are 3 models, and each of them should be evaluated separately, which is very demanding, but I do see the wisdom of this. I mean, I absolutely agree with this insistence, although it might probably require a more complex regulatory process. Okay? We're coming near to the end, but there are really recent development. And as I said at the beginning, what I'm trying to capture here is something that is happening now. So I'm sure some of the things I told you will become very quickly obsolete. But for now, this is where we are. So a few months ago, the FDA published this document here. It's a guidance. Guidance are non-binding documents, but it's the regulator that say, well, you know, you should do like that and that. And if you follow this guide, usually things work well for you. It's on the ground recommendation, you know, based on the observation, the mistake that are seen, repeated again and again, etc. They're very useful. They're a very useful document. Now, the FDA published the first guidance about how to report evidence obtained with computer modeling in the study, in this case, of a medical device. Okay? And there are a few things. Again, it's a long report, very detailed. It's available online. It's public. You can download it and read it for your own. But there are some key concepts that are worth to be mentioned. The first is the insistence on the context of use. And we'll come back on this in a minute when we talk about the new ASME standard. But the point is, you can't say, I have a model. You have to say what the model is for. Because the same model can be used to predict different things under different conditions. And in one case, it can be very accurate, and in second case, can be completely off. So you cannot characterize the accuracy, the reliability, the credibility of a model independently from the context of use. First concept, okay? So you need to start from the quantity of interest, the thing that you want to predict, and say how they relate to the use you want to do with them, okay? So after you predict, what are you going to do with those predictions? More specifically, you have to elaborate in great detail what is the scope of the analysis, what you're trying to achieve. If your medical device, for example, is produced in multiple sizes, are you going to analyze all of them? Are you going to analyze the smallest because with respect to that particular hazard, you want to check the smallest is the one high risk, so if you're okay in the smallest, the bigger will be easily okay? How it is, under which configuration. You're testing the strength of a hip replacement for normal weighted patients. Do you want to test it also for obese patients? And so on and so forth, okay? Remember, medical devices are very much physical devices, so a lot of this model are biophysical models, okay? And so declaring which general type of analysis. Are you doing a fluidodynamic analysis? Are you doing solid mechanics? Are you doing electromagnetic simulation? Has to be declared. Why? Because there is a whole body of knowledge about how to test the reliability of these classes of models, okay? That comes from general engineering. They're not specific for medical application, but still they're very useful. Of course, you have to go through your verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification. And then you have to draw a conclusion which will be valid only for that context of use. So if you tomorrow change the context of use, you have to do it again. Good. 2 days ago, literally 2 days ago, I finally had access to the very first draft of what appears to be the first technical standard that will be available soon on how actually do the verification and the validation of computer modeling to be used to test medical devices. the American Society for Mechanical Engineers has a very long tradition of technical standardization committees in the area of verification and validation for general engineering. So it was decided by the group of specialists that wanted to develop this standard that that was the best place where to go, okay? I mean, all this is being very much US driven, so that's the reason why it's an American standardization body. That shouldn't be a problem. I mean, if this standard is approved and it works, it will harmonize. There will be probably an ISO version soon, and then we will be able to use it. And even before that, if there is no European standard available, you can refer to an American standard. This is acceptable. Even in the European regulatory process, I mean. So, what is the scope of this committee, the VNV40? Well, as I said, to set the standard for the verification and validation of computer modeling of medical devices, okay? And this is the charter. The link that you see here brings you to a page where the draft standard is available for public review. The process is a bit complex, so you will not be able to download the document. You will have to write to the announcement requiring a printed hard copy that was sent to you by post. But that's the way the process is handled, and there are reasons for this. And the comment period ends very soon, okay? So if you are a specialist and you want to say your opinion, hurry up, because the window of opportunity is closing. It's not true. I mean, after this, there will be other steps in the, and when the standard is published, then, you know, we can discuss, and we think if there's something we all agree that is wrong, it will be possible to make a revision. Standards are living things. Periodically, they are revised and updated, okay? So what this said, and I repeat, I got it 2 days ago, so I might say not entirely accurate things, okay? So first, the standard provides 5 definitions. 3 are quite obvious for an engineer working in modeling. The other 2 are quite new. So verification means how accurately you're solving the mathematics that you use to describe the reality. So is the numerical accuracy that you have in solving the math. Validation is how accurately your mathematics is predicting the reality you want to predict. And the third is the uncertainty quantification. How the uncertainty that affect your inputs will propagate and affect your predictions. That, as I said, these 3 things should be familiar to anyone who is a practitioner in this field. The 2 new concepts are applicability and credibility. And they are tightly related. So, how relevant is the validation evidence to support using the model in this context of use? So, the point is, not only you have to tell me that your model works, but you have to tell me that you show that it works in the context that is relevant for the context of use that you are planning to use it. Let me make an example. You're making a solid mechanics model. You're trying to predict if a piece of metal will break under a given force, okay? And you are assuming that you have sorry, not to break. Bad example. I didn't prepare this, and in fact, this shows. It was an extemporary. So let's say that you want to predict the deflection of a piece of metal. Okay, so how much it will bend under a given force. Okay, and you assume that your material will behave elastically, linearly elastically. Okay, so if you double the force, also the displacement will double. Okay. And you validate your model by running experiments where the force applied is small enough that the metal actually behave as an elastic material. And in fact, you find very good agreement between your model and your experiments. And you say, well, my model is validated. But then the context of use, you want to use this model to predict if the doctor will be able to do a plastic bend of an intramedullary nail to shape it in the anatomy of the patient. And that involves much higher forces, And if you try to simulate your elastic model, will be absolutely wrong. So it is the same model, but what is the question you're posing to your model might produce a reliable or an unreliable answer. Okay? So this is the applicability. Convince me that the evidence you produce that your model is accurate are applicable to the particular context of use that you want to demonstrate to me, regulator. Okay? And the last is the credibility. And the credibility is a very broad concept. But I think it is important. I mean, engineers are always uncomfortable when we are faced with this not exact, credibility sounds a sociological thing. So, but I see the wisdom in this. The point is, how risky is what you're trying to do? Because, if the prediction that your model that your model produces is used to take a decision, and if that decision is wrong, something really bad will happen to a lot of people. So the risks are very high. Well, I want to check very thoroughly. So you have to convince me, okay? But, there are other scenarios where the reach of your conclusion is much more limited, and even if you're wrong, the impact might be minimal in terms of safety or efficacy. So in that case, in order to be credible, you probably have to do a lot less. Okay? So how this credibility will be established? Well, the process that the draft standard suggests is this. Of course, you have to start from the purpose. So for example, I want to predict the peak cyclic stress and from that predict the risk of fatigue fracture of a medical device. That's the purpose of my model. You have to define the context of use. So under which operational conditions you want your model to be accurately predictive. And you say, well, what I want to do in reality is to replace a bench test that is described in a technical standard, the ISO 7206 Part 4, and I want to apply it to a titanium alloy cementless hip stem. So I would like to, instead of doing the bench test, I would like to run a simulation. Okay? Okay, you have to do a risk analysis. So what could go wrong? What is the hazard? What are the probability? And the two elements that the standard recommends you have to consider are how much the prediction of the model will influence the final decision, and how severe will be the effect if the decision is wrong. And this two factor might position you in this two-dimensional map in region of high risk or region of low risk or medium risk. Okay? And the higher is the risk, the more severe, the more thorough should be the process that you use to demonstrate the credibility of your model. No? The particular output that comes out of the risk analysis are the credibility thresholds. And this can be, for example, the predictive error of my model cannot be more than 10% of the fatigue limit. So I expect my model to be 90% accurate in all comparison with experimental tests. Okay? That is a very practical reference. Okay? And you have to explain how you go from the risk analysis to that magical number. You cannot pull it out like that. Okay? And that is going to be challenging. And the first times we try to do this, a lot of things will have to go into this. And once this type of threshold are clear, you can make your validation plan. So you say, okay, in order to demonstrate that model, to predict that with this accuracy, what I have to do? Well, I need to run 7 experiments with these loads on these specimens, and I put strain gauges, and I compare the measurement with my prediction, and the real plan comes out. Okay. Now, this is the table they offer you of all the things you have to. I call it the winding road to credibility. But again, to try to summarize it into a simpler framework, at the risk of being partially inaccurate. So the first step is verification, and verification is made of two things. The first is code verification, and what they say, you have both to verify the numerical accuracy of your code, and you have to demonstrate that you have quality assurance in the software that implement your code. Okay, so in the first case, you produce, typically benchmark regression analysis. In the second, you have to produce a certificate of some quality assurance standard, etc. I think that here is where it became obvious the advantage of working with commercial software like ANSYS or Abacus, etc. Why? Because this company do have an extremely robust set of tests that they ran and certificates that can provide you upon request for these things. So this can be incredibly complicated. If you read the verification manual of ANSYS or of other similar commercial software, it's 1,000 pages with hundreds and hundreds of tests. Okay? You don't do this with your homemade, So I do see a scope here for commercial code. Absolutely, it would be very difficult for a university software to go through something like that. Okay, not impossible, but very demanding. But then there is a part that you have to do no matter what, which is the calculation verification. And depending on what your model is and which type of problem you try to solve, this might be a quantification of discretization error. It might be a calculation of the solver error. And one interesting thing that they insist is what they call the use error. And when I read, because I couldn't understand what the use error is the man in the middle, the woman in the middle. For example, are you transcribing the final number from the screen to a piece of paper or retyping? What if you put a zero too many or too little? Can happen, So in your risk analysis, you also have to consider all these factors. And then you do validation. This is a picture I'm particularly proud of when many years ago we were working on the model to predict the fracture in femur, and we could show not only the force but the location of the fracture to happen consistently. These are the type of things you have to do. Set up experiments that demonstrate the validity. And the approach they propose is that you have to separate what they call credibility factors, and in particular the separation is from the model form and the model inputs, which is in a way they're artificial because also the model form is a set of inputs. But the logic is, okay, for example, the constitutive equation that you use for the material, or the geometry that you start to generate your finite element model, that is the form of your model, okay? Which is different, for example, from an input you might introduce every time you run the model to simulate a particular process, okay? So they keep these two separated. And then there is the comparator. The comparator is the true value, the value that you use to compare with your prediction. And this, depending on the case, can come from a bench test or a laboratory experiment, either done on artificial material or, like in this case, on ex vivo, on cadaveric materials, or in some cases, the evidence comes from in vivo, so an experiment that you run on animal or on patients, okay? When you compare your model to the measurements, they propose 5 levels. I have to say, I like very much this draft. It's very well written. A lot of very clever people have been working on this, and you can see this. This is probably the part that I like less. And the approach we use in Insignio is a bit different than this. Some of you might remember this approach that we're suggesting at 3 levels, which is more framed as a stochastic reasoning between the model and the measurement, where class 1 is my model represent one of the possible entry among all that you can measure. Class 2 is my model predict a value which is close to the average of the value you can measure. Class 3 is my model can predict every single instance that you can measure. Okay, they took a different approach, and it's more about how thorough is the comparison. So, for example, level 1, you look at the picture from the experiment, the picture from the computer as well. They look similar, and that's the lowest possible comparison. Okay, and the most severe is that you expect a predictive accuracy of 95% or better, which is very, very tight for a lot of complex simulation. I would say it's almost impossible to get that close. And the statistical distribution of all the inputs are known, so you have quantified the variability of your inputs, and you know how they propagate. So you have a full quantification of the uncertainty. But probably the things that I found most interesting is this. And there is a very similar picture in the standard, but I didn't think I had the permission to reproduce. So instead I used a slide that was publicly presented by a colleague and a friend, Tina Morrison, who is the FDA specialist for this area. So I'm using your material, Tina. This graph is very, very important. It's probably the most important of all this standard. And it has to do, again, with the context of use. So imagine that your model has two inputs, x1 and x2, okay? And you validate your model with 5 experiments, which are the 5 dots, which each experiment validate the model with a particular value of x1 and a particular value of x2, within a range which is showed by these 2 bars, okay? The black curve around the dot represent the uncertainty of the experiment, okay? The confidence interval, for example, of the experimental measurement. So in this area, you know that the confidence you have in your model is very high because it compares well with the experiment in that area. The further away you move from here, your confidence gets lower, okay? Because you actually haven't tested your model so far away in the parameter space, okay? Now, they make 3 cases. They say, well, there are 3 possibilities. The first is the context of use you want to use your model for falls perfectly within this area of high reliability. And that's very easy. And that's the best case, okay? The second case is where your context of use is mostly in this area, but there are some cases that actually, so you're on the border, okay? And the third is you're trying to extrapolate. And that is the more risky. Point is, even in this can be allowed if the risk analysis justifies. So if you want to use the model to demonstrate, I don't know, that the order of magnitude of the stress is 10 times smaller than the critical stress. So even if your model is wrong 50%, you're still okay. It might be acceptable, okay? But it's very different if you're working in CO1, CO2, and CO3, okay? I told you, as I was reading, I asked myself, what are we missing? And very little, I have to say. As I said, it's a very good draft. I would have very few comments. But in this winding road to credibility, I think there is one omission. Where is the credibility of the analyst? And as far as I could see, and I repeat, it was a quick read, maybe in a corner it's mentioned, but as far as I could see, this is not referred anywhere in the standard. It could be that in reality, obviously that standard referred to other standard, which I didn't have the time to go and recover. So I want to be very careful. It might be that this is addressed, okay? But if it's not, I think that this could be a problem because in the old days when computer modeling in engineering was at the very beginning, you could do certain type of finite element analysis or computational fluid dynamics in important things like in aircraft or in engine, only if you had the appropriate certifications. And there were organisms worldwide that would test your ability and certify your ability, okay? As the field matured, why? Because at the beginning, the expertise of the individual was really making the difference. The instruments were so immature, the method were so new that it was important that you were an expert, okay? As the field matured in general engineering, this requirement is still present in some specific areas, but today it's much less demanding. But here we're back to square one. This is an area where modeling and simulation is put in a very big challenge. And we need to be sure that the analyst is expert enough and properly trained that something stupid happened, he or she can recognize it and act accordingly. So I think that this is an important element. And this brings me back to where I started for. I think that in this emerging scenario that I described to you today, it is absolutely vital that we as universities start to train the first generation of specialists in computational medicine, and in particular in silico clinical trials. So the new master that we are enrolling starting from next September is definitely one of the few educational offerings in the world that is absolutely tailored on this very specific objective. And I think it will be a great resource for training this specialist worldwide. So I am at my conclusions. First, I hope I convinced you that in silico medicine is turning from a dream of a few visionary researchers to an industrial reality. And this is very important for our research community. I talked to you about software quality assurance, and I believe that this is a reasonably mature field. There are experts, there are practitioners. So a company who enter in this endeavor should not find too difficult to find consultants that help them to establish a robust software quality assurance. The regulatory pathway for software as a medical device is stabilizing. I think we are close to have a stable pathway. And as we go and more products are certified, it should become simpler and simpler. You know, the less de novo cases will appear, okay? So really, I think we're stable. We just lack a little bit of maturity in the field. As more cases go through the system, it will get easier. The digital patient software as a medical device, so the one used to predict as decision support system for individual patients, it remains challenging. And here we need to call our community for those who will go and do the first in class. The one who break the ice of the regulatory process here will have to go through a lot of hoops. And I wonder whether here it might be wiser that this happens not necessarily driven entirely by a for-profit scenario of a single company, but more as a collaborative intent between academia and industry, especially for classes of software that will be widely used in the field. In silico clinical trials is going to transform the regulatory process for medical device. I have no doubt about that, but it's going to take some time. We're really at the beginning. Also, I was impressed by how quickly the regulatory bodies, the standardization agency, have been able to react. In a little bit more than a year, we passed from the legislator saying you should do it to having the first draft standard. This is amazing, and chapeau to all the people involved in this amazing work. It will take a few years before the regulatory pathways for in silico clinical trials stabilize and mature enough, but I believe that as for all disruptive innovation, early adopters will harvest the biggest benefit. I know a lot of companies are sitting on the fence now saying, should we go for this or should we not? The answer, I believe, is yes, you should go, because if you do it early, this will be a huge competitive advantage, and you have to pursue it. So that's it. everything is done or in the process of being doing. There's no future. Okay, there's always a future. We're academics. So what is the next grand challenge? Well, I'm sure many have many different opinions. Mine is personalized in silico. So, and I use as a guiding example a custom-made device that was quite popular a few years ago, and then it was dropped because it was practically impossible to manage the product's life cycle. Custom-made hip replacement, okay? So the idea is you take your patient, you make a CT scan, and then you design the prosthesis to be tailored to the patient anatomy so that they fit perfectly, correct all deformities. Okay, today, if you want to do this, what do you have to do? After you design it, you fabricate this in a few copies, you test it to make sure that it's safe, and then the surgeon will implant it. And this typically takes 3 weeks. And because even if you do the test, there cannot be a full regulatory process, the surgeon will take some of the responsibility with the manufacturer if something goes wrong, which obviously is something the surgeons don't like, you know, because it's a shared responsibility. Other medical products, the product responsibility is with the manufacturer, and the surgeon has only the responsibility for the surgery. Okay. So as a result, except for very special cases today, this doesn't happen anymore. And it typically takes 3 weeks from when you scan the patient to when you can operate, even more. But what if tomorrow we could design the device, do a full set of standardized tests in silico that are being certified as a process, and then when everything is okay, we manufacture with a rapid manufacturing system and implant it. And with a turnaround of days instead of weeks, and with a fully certified pipeline that puts no responsibility on the doctor. It can be done. It's difficult. That's the next research goal for our community. Before I finish, I would like to acknowledge a lot of people. So first, my 3 co-authors that worked at this presentation. Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure to work with the 3 of you. A lot of institutions contributed to this change of culture around in silico clinical trial. I want to mention the VPH Institute, of which I have the honor to still be the president. The new Avicenna Alliance, an alliance between industry and academia that works on the promotion of predictive medicine, and also the MDIC Consortium, a regulator industry academia alliance in the United States that was very important to promote this transformation within the FDA. Some funding agency that has supported my research in this area, and 2 people in particular, Pat Lowford, my colleague, my friend, one of the founders of Insignia, who is being also my co-teacher in the module this year. Thank you, Pat, for all the support and the useful conversation. And Tina. Tina is an amazing woman. She is single-handedly pushing this field. And she is, I hope one day I'll be able to have her in Sheffield and give you a seminar, and you'll be impressed by how energetic this FDA officer is. And she gave me a lot of help and support, and I need to thank her. And I also want to thank Christian Gasser, Flora Musumbra from EMEA, and Marcus Rayton from Medtronic for a series of conversations that we have that guided in the preparation of this. So I'd like to thank you. The slides are available on Figshare. This is the DOI. They're publicly available, so you're welcome to download and disseminate. Thank you very much.